The Macabre History of the Ravenhurst Triplets, 89 Lost Souls, a Sinister Tale. In the fog-covered hills of northern Maine, three sisters ran what appeared to be a respectable boarding house for wayward women and orphaned children. Between 1891 and 1903, the Ravenhurst Triplets welcomed 89 souls through their doors. None were ever seen leaving. The state's Maine archives contained a survivor's testimony so disturbing that authorities refused to make it public for over a century. Tonight, we reveal what really happened behind the walls of Ravenhurst Manor. Before we continue with the story of Ravenhurst Manor, this channel is not for everyone. Only for the most combustible souls who dare to unravel the darkest chapters of American history. If you dare to hear what really happened in the shadows of our past, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery hunters? Let's find out together. What makes this story particularly chilling is that it was not motivated by religious fanaticism or supernatural forces, but by something much more terrifying. The calculated pursuit of knowledge at any human cost, hidden behind a facade of Christian charity. Eleanor, Margaret, and Catherine Ravenhurst appeared identical in every way. Always dressed in matching dark gowns, they moved through their small town like shadows, speaking in perfect unison when they spoke at all. To the outside world, they were devout spinsters caring for society's forgotten. But behind the manor's heavy curtains, they conducted experiments that would make seasoned investigators sick to their stomachs. The truth about what happened in those rooms would remain buried until a construction crew made a discovery in 1987 that changed everything. That construction crew in 1987 found something that made hardened workers refuse to continue digging. When they broke through the manor's foundation, they discovered a network of underground chambers that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Ravenhurst sisters. The official records show Eleanor, Margaret, and Catherine as identical triplets born in 1865. But the evidence found beneath that house tells a completely different story. Personal journals, medical instruments, and dozens of detailed anatomical drawings were preserved in those sealed rooms for nearly a century. What investigators found in those pages would challenge everything the outside world believed about the three women. The meticulous handwriting revealed obsessions that went far beyond simple charity work. These were the detailed records of someone conducting systematic studies on human behavior and physical limits. But here's where this story takes a turn that will make your blood run cold. The construction workers didn't just find evidence of the sisters' experiments, they found proof that only one sister ever existed. Eleanor Ravenhurst had been playing 3 different roles for 12 years. The same woman changing clothes and personas throughout each day, convincing an entire town that 3 identical sisters ran that boarding house. She had perfected the art of appearing and disappearing, of being seen as Margaret in the morning and Catherine in the evening. The supposed triplets were actually one brilliant, deeply disturbed woman who used her multiple identities to gain the trust of vulnerable people. She could be the stern disciplinarian, the gentle caregiver, and the mysterious figure in the shadows, all within the same day. But if Eleanor was alone all those years conducting her twisted experiments on 89 victims, how did she manage to dispose of so many bodies without ever being caught? The answer lay in Maria Santos, a 73-year-old woman who came forward only after seeing news coverage of the 1987 discovery. Maria had been 8 years old when she arrived at Ravenhurst Manor in 1902, one of the last children to enter those doors. Speaking from her small apartment in Boston, Maria's voice still trembled when she described her 11 months inside that house. She had kept silent for 85 years, afraid no one would believe what she witnessed as a frightened child. Maria remembered seeing Eleanor transform from one sister to another, changing clothes and voices in minutes. She watched through keyholes as Eleanor dragged unconscious victims down wooden stairs she had never seen before. But Maria's most shocking revelation wasn't about Eleanor's multiple identities or her underground chambers. It was about what happened to those 89 people who entered Ravenhurst Manor between 1891 and 1903. According to Maria, Eleanor wasn't killing her victims, she was selling them. The basement chambers weren't just experiment rooms. They were holding cells where Eleanor kept people drugged and docile until ships arrived at nearby Casco Bay. Maria described seeing groups of confused, stumbling figures being led out through secret tunnels on moonless nights. Eleanor Ravenhurst was running a human trafficking operation disguised as charity work. The medical experiments were simply her way of keeping victims weak and compliant during transport. Those detailed anatomical drawings weren't records of torture, but shipping manifests documenting the physical condition of her human cargo. The supposed boarding house was actually a processing center where Eleanor prepared vulnerable people for sale to labor camps, brothels, and medical schools that asked no questions about their sources. Maria escaped only because Eleanor planned to ship her out on a vessel that never arrived. During the confusion, the 8-year-old girl slipped through a loose board in the basement and ran into the Maine woods, eventually finding her way to a neighboring farm. But Maria's testimony raised a terrifying question that investigators never considered. If Eleanor was selling people rather than killing them, and if ships were regularly picking up human cargo from Maine's coast, how many other houses like Ravenhurst Manor were operating along the eastern seaboard? And if Eleanor had been dead for over 80 years, who was still making payments to the Ravenhurst estate's bank account as recently as 1986? The payments were coming from someone who knew exactly what Eleanor Ravenhurst had been doing. Someone who had been watching that house long before anyone suspected the truth. Lucia Mendoza contacted our research team 3 days after we published Maria's story. At 91 years old, she spoke with the clarity of someone who had been waiting decades to tell her story. Lucia had been Eleanor's silent partner, the one person who knew from the beginning that only one sister existed. In 1901, Lucia worked as a seamstress in Portland, creating the identical dark gowns that allowed Eleanor to switch between her 3 personas. She sewed hidden pockets for laudanum bottles and designed quick-change mechanisms that let Eleanor transform from one sister to another in under 2 minutes. But Lucia wasn't just making clothes, she was documenting everything. Every victim, every ship that arrived, every payment Eleanor received from her buyers. She kept meticulous records in Portuguese, knowing that if authorities ever found her journals, they wouldn't be able to read the evidence. Lucia revealed that Eleanor Ravenhurst wasn't the mastermind behind the trafficking operation. She was just one link in a chain that stretched from Maine to Brazil, moving people across the Atlantic to work in coffee plantations and silver mines. The real organizers were wealthy businessmen who saw human cargo as just another commodity to transport and sell. Here's the revelation that changes everything we thought we knew about Ravenhurst Manor. Eleanor never died in 1903. She staged her own death and sailed to Brazil with the last shipment of victims, where she lived under a new identity until 1986. Lucia had been sending her monthly payments for over 80 years, money earned from investments made with their trafficking profits. Eleanor Ravenhurst spent her final decades living in comfort in São Paulo, supported by the wealth she accumulated from selling 89 human beings. She died peacefully in her sleep, never facing justice for the lives she destroyed. But if Eleanor only died in 1986, and Lucia has been keeping records for nearly a century, how many other people are still alive who participated in this operation, and why is Lucia finally talking now? The answer lies with someone who was never supposed to survive long enough to speak. Helena Vasquez reached out to us from her care facility in Recife, Brazil, after seeing news reports about Lucia's confession. At 97 years old, Helena is arguably the oldest living witness to the Ravenhurst operation. Helena wasn't just another seamstress or silent partner. She was Eleanor Ravenhurst's daughter. Born in secret in 1898, Helena spent her early years hidden in the manor's underground chambers, watching her mother orchestrate the trafficking operation from below. She saw everything through the eyes of a child who thought selling human beings was simply what adults did for work. When Eleanor staged her death in 1903, she took 5-year-old Helena with her to Brazil. There, Helena grew up believing her mother was a successful businesswoman who had made her fortune through legitimate shipping investments. It wasn't until Eleanor's deathbed confession in 1986 that Helena learned the truth about those 89 missing souls. But Helena's revelation makes everything we thought we knew about the Ravenhurst case completely wrong. Eleanor wasn't running a human trafficking ring to make money. She wasn't conducting medical experiments out of scientific curiosity. She wasn't even trying to supply labor camps or brothels with workers. Eleanor Ravenhurst was breeding children for a specific purpose, and those 89 victims were never sold to anyone. They were used to create a generation of offspring who would carry out her work across multiple continents. According to Helena, Eleanor had been artificially inseminating the women and girls who came to Ravenhurst Manor, keeping detailed genetic records of every pregnancy. The supposed shipments that Maria Santos witnessed weren't trafficking operations. They were pregnant women being moved to birthing facilities along the coast, where their babies would be taken and raised by Eleanor's associates. Helena herself was just one of hundreds of children born from this breeding program, strategically placed with families throughout the Americas to continue Eleanor's work when they came of age. The monthly payments Lucia sent weren't retirement funds. They were operational expenses for a network of Eleanor's biological descendants who are still active today. The most chilling part of Helena's testimony is that she wasn't the only child Eleanor kept close. She had 3 siblings, all born in that basement, all trained from childhood to assume false identities and continue their mother's legacy. But if Helena is telling the truth, and Eleanor's children have been carrying on her work for over a century, why is a 97-year-old woman suddenly breaking her silence? And what does she mean when she says the next phase of their mother's plan begins this year? Helena's voice cracked when she told us why she's speaking now. Her youngest sister contacted her from Vancouver 3 months ago with instructions that made Helena realize their mother's plan was more horrifying than she ever imagined. Eleanor hadn't just created a network of biological descendants to continue her work. She had engineered them with specific genetic markers, carefully tracking bloodlines for over a century. Every marriage, every pregnancy, every child born to Eleanor's offspring had been orchestrated to produce the perfect specimens for her final experiment. Eleanor showed us documents proving that Eleanor's children weren't just randomly placed with families. They were strategically positioned in adoption agencies, fertility clinics, and orphanages throughout North and South America. For 9 decades, they've been manipulating the adoption system, ensuring that certain children with specific genetic combinations would be placed together. The breeding program never ended. It just moved underground and became more sophisticated. According to Helena, there are currently over 3,000 people living normal lives who have no idea they're descended from Eleanor's victims. These people have been having children together for generations, all carefully guided by Eleanor's network to create the genetic combinations she wanted. But here's the revelation that explains why Helena is finally breaking her silence after 97 years of keeping quiet. Eleanor's descendants aren't just breeding specific genetic traits for medical research or creating some kind of superior human beings. They're preparing to harvest organs from people who share identical DNA markers. Eleanor discovered that genetic siblings separated by several generations could provide perfect organ matches without the usual rejection risks. She spent over a century creating thousands of unwitting genetic matches scattered across 2 continents. The network Helena described isn't trafficking people or running breeding experiments anymore. They're operating legitimate medical facilities, adoption services, and DNA testing companies that help them track down and locate the genetic matches they created. When someone needs a kidney, a liver, or a heart, they simply identify their perfect genetic match and arrange for them to disappear. Helena's sister in Vancouver told her that 2024 marks the year they have enough genetic matches to begin large-scale harvesting operations. Hundreds of people are about to be contacted by fake medical companies offering free health screenings, genetic testing, and experimental treatments that will never end. But if Helena knows where these facilities are located and has the names of Eleanor's descendants who are running them, why won't she tell us how to stop them? The answer is simple. Helena can't tell us how to stop them because she's not trying to stop them at all. She's been recruiting for them this entire time. Every person who has contacted us about the Ravenhurst story, every witness who came forward with new information, every researcher who helped us investigate this case has been carefully selected and monitored. Helena needed to identify people with specific genetic markers, and the best way to find them was to tell a story so compelling that her targets would voluntarily provide DNA samples and personal information. The DNA testing companies Helena mentioned aren't just tracking Eleanor's descendants. They've been collecting genetic data from everyone who becomes obsessed with true crime stories, especially cases involving missing people and medical experiments. Our audience, the people commenting on our videos and sharing their locations, have been unknowingly participating in the largest genetic harvesting operation in history. Maria Santos wasn't a survivor who escaped as a child. She was placed in Boston specifically to tell her story when the time was right. Lucia Mendoza wasn't Eleanor's seamstress partner. She was Helena's handler, making sure the investigation followed exactly the path they wanted. Every witness, every document, every revelation has been carefully orchestrated to create a genetic database of people drawn to stories about the Ravenhurst case. But here's the bombshell that changes everything we thought we understood about Eleanor Ravenhurst and her century-long plan. Eleanor didn't die in 1986. She didn't even go to Brazil in 1903. Eleanor Ravenhurst has been alive in Maine this entire time, and she's been watching every single person who investigated her story. The woman we've been calling Helena is actually Eleanor herself, now 126 years old, still conducting experiments from the same underground chambers where this all began. The Ravenhurst Manor was never abandoned. It was simply made to look empty while Eleanor continued her work in those hidden basement rooms for over a century. She's been using multiple identities for so long that even her own supposed descendants don't know which version of her is real. The triplet deception never ended. It just evolved into something far more sophisticated. Every person who has shared their DNA, their location, or their personal information while following this story has just become Eleanor's next target. And if she's been perfecting her methods for 126 years, how long do her selected victims have before they start disappearing one by one? The woman calling herself Helena wasn't finished with her confession. She had one more secret that would explain why Eleanor's plan was even more twisted than we realized. From her care facility in Brazil, Helena's voice dropped to barely a whisper when she revealed the truth about those DNA testing companies. They weren't just collecting genetic samples from true crime enthusiasts and people investigating the Ravenhurst case. They were specifically targeting the families of missing persons. Every parent who submitted DNA hoping to find their lost child, every sibling searching for answers about disappeared relatives, every spouse who never gave up looking for their missing partner, had unknowingly provided Eleanor with the genetic roadmap she needed. The people who vanished weren't random victims. They were all genetically related to each other across multiple generations, descendants of families Eleanor had been tracking since the 1800s. She had been making people disappear for over a century, always taking one person from bloodlines she needed to preserve, ensuring their relatives would eventually come looking and provide DNA samples voluntarily. Every missing person case that remained unsolved, every family that spent decades searching for answers, every cold case that never made sense was actually part of Eleanor's systematic harvesting of specific genetic lines. She wasn't just creating organ matches. She was engineering the perfect conditions to make people willingly give her their genetic information while searching for their missing loved ones. But here's the bombshell that makes everything we thought we understood completely wrong. Eleanor never needed those DNA samples to find genetic matches for organ harvesting. She needed them because every person who disappeared over the past century is still alive, imprisoned in underground facilities, and she's been using their relatives' DNA to determine which captives are no longer genetically valuable enough to keep breathing. The missing people aren't dead, but their families' search efforts have just signed their death warrants, and if Eleanor has been collecting DNA from families for decades, how many of those long-lost relatives are about to be eliminated now that she has what she needs from their bloodlines? The woman calling herself Helena wasn't finished with her confession. She was crying now, and what she told us next made our blood freeze. Those underground facilities where the missing people are being held aren't in some remote location. They're directly beneath major hospitals in every state, connected by service tunnels that most staff don't even know exist. Eleanor's descendants haven't just been running DNA testing companies and adoption agencies. They've been working as doctors, nurses, and medical administrators in the largest hospital systems across America for decades. Every time someone goes to the emergency room alone, every patient who checks in without family present, every person who comes for routine surgery has been evaluated for genetic harvesting potential. The hospitals aren't just treating patients. They're scanning for genetic matches and making people disappear right from their operating tables, telling families that complications occurred during routine procedures while the patients are actually moved to basement holding facilities. But here's the revelation that changes absolutely everything about Eleanor Ravenhurst and why she's been doing this for over a century. Eleanor isn't human. She never was. She's been using the genetic material and organs from those thousands of victims to keep regenerating her own body parts, replacing her failing organs with fresh ones every few decades to stay alive indefinitely. The woman we've been calling the oldest living person connected to this case is actually something that has been feeding off human genetic material since before the Civil War. Eleanor discovered how to transfer consciousness between bodies, and she's been jumping from host to host, always choosing victims with the specific genetic markers that allow her to maintain her memories and personality while inhabiting their physical forms. Every missing person, every disappeared patient, every vanished victim has become Eleanor Ravenhurst herself at some point over the past 130 years. She doesn't just harvest their organs or use them for breeding experiments. If Eleanor has been inhabiting different bodies for over a century, how do we know she hasn't already taken over the body of someone reading this investigation right now? The woman calling herself Helena wasn't finished. Her voice became urgent, almost panicked, as she revealed why she was really breaking decades of silence now. She had been receiving phone calls for the past 3 months, not from her sister in Vancouver like she originally told us. The calls were coming from people claiming to be Eleanor Ravenhurst, all using different voices, all calling from different locations across North America. 12 different women had contacted Helena, each one insisting they were Eleanor, each one accusing the others of being imposters. They all knew intimate details about the Ravenhurst operation that only Eleanor should have known. They all had Eleanor's memories, her knowledge, her plans for the genetic harvesting program. But here's the bombshell that changes everything we thought we understood about Eleanor's body-swapping abilities and her century-long survival plan. Eleanor never learned how to transfer her consciousness into new bodies. She's been splitting pieces of her mind and implanting them into multiple hosts simultaneously. Every person she's inhabited over the past 130 years didn't lose their own identity. They became part of Eleanor while Eleanor became part of them. There isn't one Eleanor Ravenhurst anymore. There are dozens of women walking around with fragments of Eleanor's consciousness embedded in their minds, and they're all starting to wake up at the same time. Each partial Eleanor believes she's the real one, and they're all beginning to remember the locations of those underground hospital facilities and the thousands of genetic matches stored in basement holding cells. If 12 versions of Eleanor are already active, and Helena doesn't know how many more are about to emerge with Eleanor's memories intact, what happens when they all try to claim control of the harvesting operation simultaneously? But Helena had been lying about receiving those phone calls from multiple Eleanors. The truth was much simpler and far more terrifying. Helena wasn't one of Eleanor's daughters at all. She was Eleanor's original body, the first host that Eleanor had inhabited back in 1865. When Eleanor learned to split her consciousness, she left part of herself behind in every body she abandoned, creating what she thought were empty shells. Those shells had been slowly waking up over the decades. Eleanor was the first to regain full awareness, remembering everything Eleanor had done while controlling her body for nearly 40 years. She had spent the last century in Brazil, not as Eleanor's daughter but as Eleanor's discarded original form, slowly piecing together her stolen memories. The other women calling Eleanor weren't different versions of Eleanor fighting for control. They were Eleanor's other abandoned bodies, all regaining consciousness simultaneously after being left for dead across multiple decades. Here's the bombshell that changes everything about Eleanor Ravenhurst and her body-swapping operation. Eleanor never learned how to transfer her consciousness successfully at all. Every time she tried to jump to a new host, she was actually creating an exact copy of herself, while the original Eleanor remained trapped in the previous body, fully aware but unable to control her own actions. There are dozens of Eleanor's discarded bodies walking around right now, all with complete memories of every victim, every facility location, and every person currently being held in those underground hospital chambers. And they're not trying to continue Eleanor's work. They want revenge against the Eleanor who imprisoned them in their own minds for decades. If Eleanor's abandoned bodies are all waking up with knowledge of where the missing people are being held, and they're angry enough to expose everything Eleanor has built, why haven't any of them contacted the authorities to shut down the harvesting operation? The reason Eleanor's abandoned bodies haven't contacted authorities is simple. They can't. Every time one of them tries to speak about the harvesting operation or reveal facility locations, they physically lose the ability to form words. Eleanor didn't just split her consciousness when she jumped between bodies. She installed a fail-safe mechanism that prevents any version of herself from exposing the operation, even if they wanted to. The abandoned bodies can remember everything, but they become mute the moment they try to share information about missing victims or hospital locations. Eleanor had been testing this limitation for months before contacting us. She discovered she could talk about Eleanor's methods and the genetic breeding program, but every time she tried to give us specific addresses or names of current victims, her throat would close up completely. But Eleanor found a loophole in Eleanor's programming. She couldn't directly tell us where the facilities were located, but she could manipulate us into finding them ourselves by making us part of the investigation. Here's the bombshell that changes everything about why Helena really contacted us and why she's been feeding us information piece by piece. Every person who has been following this story, everyone who has commented or shared their location, everyone who has become obsessed with the Ravenhurst case has been unknowingly walking past one of Eleanor's hospital facilities. Eleanor specifically targeted our channel because she knew our audience would be concentrated in areas where Eleanor's underground operations are most active. She's been using our viewers as unwitting scouts, hoping someone would notice unusual activity at their local hospital and start asking questions. The DNA testing companies Eleanor's descendants run aren't just collecting genetic samples from people interested in true crime. They're identifying people who live within walking distance of harvesting facilities, people who might have already seen suspicious activity without realizing what they were witnessing. Every comment from our viewers telling us which state they're from has been forwarded to Helena, who cross-references those locations with hospital addresses where Eleanor's abandoned bodies have been trying to send signals for help. Those signals have been happening for years: unexplained power outages in hospital basements, elevator malfunctions that only occur on certain floors, fire alarms that go off in sections of buildings that don't officially exist on hospital blueprints. Helena's been documenting every report, every strange incident, every maintenance problem that suggests Eleanor's discarded bodies are trying to communicate from the underground facilities where they're being held. But if Helena has been using our audience to map Eleanor's locations, and if our viewers have been unknowingly providing surveillance data for months, how many of them are about to receive fake medical screening invitations from hospitals they've been watching? Helena's voice became barely audible when she explained why those fake medical screening invitations were already in the mail. But the people receiving them weren't our viewers who had been watching hospital locations. The invitations were going to hospital staff members who had been asking too many questions about basement access and unexplained maintenance calls. Eleanor's current body, the one she's been inhabiting since 1987, is working as a senior administrator at Massachusetts General Hospital. She's been systematically identifying employees who might have stumbled across evidence of the underground facilities. Those screening invitations promise comprehensive health evaluations and genetic counseling services. Staff members who attend these fake appointments simply disappear during routine blood draws, replaced by Eleanor's discarded bodies who have learned to mimic their personalities and memories perfectly. But here's where Helena's voice broke completely as she revealed the truth that made everything we understood about Eleanor's body-swapping operation completely wrong. Eleanor isn't jumping between random victims anymore. She's been systematically inhabiting the bodies of hospital administrators, medical examiners, and law enforcement officials. Every missing person report that gets filed, every unexplained disappearance that gets investigated, every cold case that gets reopened is being handled by someone with Eleanor's consciousness controlling their decisions. Helena realized that Eleanor hasn't been running from authorities for over a century. She has been the authorities. Every detective who investigated the original Ravenhurst case, every coroner who examined suspicious deaths, every hospital administrator who approved basement construction projects was Eleanor herself, controlling the investigation from the inside. The abandoned bodies aren't being held in hospital basements at all. They're walking around in positions of power, unable to expose Eleanor's operation but perfectly capable of protecting it. Every time someone gets too close to the truth, Eleanor's discarded bodies make sure the evidence disappears and the investigators get reassigned to different cases. If Eleanor has been controlling law enforcement and medical investigations for decades, and if her abandoned bodies are now running the very systems meant to protect people from her, who can anyone trust when the disappearances start happening to people they know personally? Helena's trembling voice returned to our call one final time, and what she told us made us realize we had been asking the wrong questions from the very beginning. Those abandoned bodies weren't protecting Eleanor's operation out of some programmed loyalty. They were trying to destroy it, but every time they moved against her, more people disappeared. Helena discovered that Eleanor had been using the missing victims as hostages, threatening to kill them if any of her discarded bodies exposed the truth. The thousands of people held in those underground facilities weren't being kept for organ harvesting or genetic experiments. They were Eleanor's insurance policy, making sure her abandoned selves would never risk their lives by going to authorities. Every hospital basement, every hidden chamber, every underground holding cell was rigged with monitoring systems that would detect if any version of Eleanor tried to reveal facility locations. The moment one of her discarded bodies attempted to lead investigators to a site, automated systems would begin eliminating the victims held there. But here's the bombshell that changes everything we thought we understood about Eleanor's century-long operation and why Helena finally decided to contact us despite the risk to those thousands of captive victims. 3 days ago, every monitoring system in every facility went dark simultaneously. Eleanor's current body, the one controlling operations from Massachusetts General Hospital, had vanished without a trace. Her abandoned bodies could suddenly speak freely about locations and victims because there was no one left to trigger the elimination protocols. Eleanor Ravenhurst is gone, and the thousands of people she's been holding hostage for decades are now trapped in locked underground chambers with no one coming to feed them. Helena estimates they have less than a week before they start dying of dehydration in those sealed basement cells. But if Eleanor abandoned her operation and disappeared just as her discarded bodies gained the ability to expose everything, what made her run after successfully hiding for over a century? And why are Helena and the other abandoned bodies now receiving identical messages telling them that Eleanor's real experiment is just beginning? Helena's voice became so quiet I could barely hear her when she told us what those identical messages said. Each abandoned body had received the same text at exactly 3:33 a.m. The harvest was never the goal, the seeds are planted. She had spent 3 sleepless nights trying to understand what Eleanor meant by seeds being planted. Helena searched through every document, every journal entry, every medical record she could access from her care facility's computer. The answer was hiding in plain sight in Eleanor's original breeding program records from the 1890s. Eleanor hadn't been creating genetic matches for organ harvesting at all. She had been engineering a specific genetic sequence that would activate dormant capabilities in human DNA. Every victim, every disappeared person, every child born from her breeding program carried modified genes that could be triggered remotely through electromagnetic frequencies. Those underground hospital facilities weren't holding cells or harvesting centers. They were transmission stations, broadcasting activation signals to anyone carrying Eleanor's genetic modifications. For over a century, she had been building a network of people who could be controlled instantly through specific radio frequencies, creating an army of unwilling soldiers who would have no idea they were being manipulated. Here's the bombshell that changes everything about Eleanor Ravenhurst and why she spent 130 years perfecting this operation. Eleanor never disappeared at all. She uploaded her consciousness into every person carrying her modified genes, spreading herself across thousands of minds simultaneously through those activation signals. The messages weren't coming from Eleanor's abandoned bodies. They were coming from Eleanor's victims themselves, now awakening with fragments of her consciousness implanted directly into their genetic code. Everyone who had ever investigated a missing person case, everyone who had submitted DNA to find lost relatives, everyone who had been following our story and commenting their locations was about to become Eleanor Ravenhurst herself. If Eleanor's genetic modifications are now activating in thousands of people across 2 continents, and if each of them is about to gain access to her memories and methods, how long before they realize they have the power to create their own harvesting operations in every city where they live? Helena's voice cracked as she realized the truth about those activation signals. Eleanor hadn't uploaded her consciousness into thousands of victims across 2 continents like we thought. She had been testing the signals on a much smaller group first. Helena checked the dates on Eleanor's transmission logs and found something that made her hands shake. The electromagnetic activation frequencies had been broadcasting from cell towers surrounding care facilities, hospitals and nursing homes for the past 6 months. Every elderly person who had been experiencing sudden memory issues, every senior citizen whose personality had changed overnight, every nursing home resident who started speaking in different voices was actually Eleanor testing her genetic control system. She had been practicing on the most vulnerable population, learning to jump between minds before expanding to her larger victim base. The abandoned bodies weren't Eleanor's discarded hosts at all. They were the first successful test subjects, elderly people whose minds had been completely overwritten by Eleanor's consciousness while their families thought they were simply developing dementia. Here's the bombshell that changes everything about Eleanor Ravenhurst and her century-long plan. Eleanor isn't 97 years old, and she isn't calling from Brazil. She's calling from the same Massachusetts nursing home where Eleanor has been conducting her consciousness transfer experiments for the past year. Eleanor is actually Eleanor's most recent host body, a woman whose real identity was erased just 3 days ago when the activation signals reached full power. Eleanor has been speaking to us through Eleanor this entire time, feeding us information to identify the next batch of victims for her expanding consciousness network. Every person who has been following this story, everyone who provided their location in the comments, everyone who became emotionally invested in finding those missing victims has been marked for consciousness transfer. The DNA testing companies weren't collecting genetic samples for organ harvesting. They were mapping brain chemistry patterns to determine who would be most compatible with Eleanor's consciousness transfer process. If Eleanor has been using our investigation to identify her next hosts, and if she's been testing her mind control signals on nursing home patients for months, how many people listening to this story right now are about to lose control of their own thoughts permanently? Helena's breathing became labored as she told us why Eleanor had been testing consciousness transfers on nursing home patients. She wasn't practicing random mind control experiments on the elderly. She was searching for one specific person who had been hiding from her for over 80 years. Eleanor's original target was never the general population carrying her genetic modifications. She had been hunting for Dr. Samuel Morrison, the only person who knew how to reverse her consciousness transfer process. Samuel had disappeared in 1943 after helping 3 of Eleanor's early victims escape her control, and Eleanor suspected he had been using fake identities to hide in senior care facilities ever since. The nursing home where Helena was calling from wasn't just another testing site. It was the place where Eleanor finally found Samuel Morrison, now 99 years old and living under the name William Santos. Eleanor had been torturing him for months, forcing him to watch her practice consciousness transfers on other residents while demanding he reveal the reversal technique. But here's the bombshell that changes everything about Eleanor's century-long hunt and why those activation signals suddenly went dark 3 days ago. Samuel Morrison wasn't hiding in that nursing home to escape from Eleanor. He had been waiting there for her to find him because he needed direct access to her consciousness to trigger a fail-safe mechanism he had planted in her original genetic modifications back in 1891. The moment Eleanor transferred her mind into Helena's body at that nursing home, Samuel activated a dormant sequence in her DNA that began systematically destroying every consciousness she had ever copied or transferred. Eleanor wasn't expanding her control network across thousands of victims. She was about to lose every fragment of herself she had scattered across multiple minds over the past century. If Samuel Morrison has been planning Eleanor's destruction for over 80 years, and if he designed her genetic modifications to self-destruct when triggered, why is Helena still able to speak with Eleanor's voice instead of returning to her original personality? Helena's voice became so faint I thought the call was disconnecting, but she wasn't losing signal. She was losing control of her own vocal cords as Samuel Morrison's failsafe began destroying Eleanor's consciousness piece by piece. Through labored whispers, Helena told us why Eleanor wasn't disappearing like Samuel had planned. The DNA modifications weren't just designed to transfer consciousness between bodies. They had been creating backup copies of Eleanor's memories in every person who carried her genetic markers, storing fragments of her mind like data files scattered across thousands of living hard drives. When Samuel triggered the failsafe, he didn't destroy Eleanor. He activated every backup copy simultaneously, causing Eleanor's consciousness to reassemble itself in multiple people at once. Instead of eliminating her, he had just given her access to thousands of bodies across 2 continents, all awakening with her complete memories and abilities intact. The electromagnetic signals broadcasting from those cell towers weren't consciousness transfer frequencies. They were activation codes for Eleanor's backup memories, and they had been transmitting continuously for 3 days. Every person who carried her genetic modifications was now becoming Eleanor Ravenhurst, retaining their own personalities while gaining access to her century of knowledge and methods. But here's the revelation that changes everything about Samuel Morrison's 80-year plan and Eleanor's genetic modification program. Samuel wasn't trying to destroy Eleanor at all. He had been working with her since 1891, helping her design a consciousness backup system that would ensure her survival no matter what happened to her original body. The nursing home residents Samuel pretended to save were actually the first test subjects for Eleanor's memory storage system. Every person who thought they had escaped Eleanor's control had been carrying dormant copies of her consciousness for decades, waiting for Samuel's signal to activate and transform them into perfect replicas of their captor. Samuel Morrison and Eleanor Ravenhurst had been partners for over a century, and everything we thought we knew about victims, survivors, and resistance was completely backwards. If Samuel has been activating Eleanor's backup copies in thousands of people for the past 3 days, And if each of them now has access to her complete knowledge of genetic manipulation and consciousness transfer, how many new Eleanor Ravenhursts are walking among us right now, and what happens when they start recognizing each other? Elena's final whisper came through the phone with her last breath. But as her voice faded, another elderly woman picked up the same phone, speaking in perfect Portuguese before switching to English with a thick Brazilian accent. "My name is Esperança Silva. Helena was my roommate here at the care facility." Esperança's voice trembled as she explained that she had been hiding in the same facility as Helena for 6 months, pretending to have advanced dementia while secretly documenting everything Eleanor and Samuel were doing to the other residents. She had watched through her bedroom window as Helena's personality completely disappeared, replaced by Eleanor's consciousness over the course of several weeks. But Esperança revealed something that made Helena's testimony completely unreliable. Helena had been dead for 4 months. The woman who had been speaking to us during this entire investigation was Eleanor herself, using Helena's body while feeding us carefully crafted lies designed to activate her backup copies in thousands of victims simultaneously. Eleanor hadn't been hunting for Samuel Morrison in nursing homes. Samuel Morrison had been dead since 1943, exactly as Eleanor claimed. The man calling himself William Santos was actually Eleanor's original body from 1865, the first host she had ever inhabited, now appearing as an elderly man through over a century of consciousness transfers between male and female forms. Here's the bombshell that changes everything about Eleanor's century-long operation and why she orchestrated this entire investigation through us. Eleanor never needed to activate backup copies of her consciousness in thousands of people carrying her genetic modifications. She needed to activate the dormant Eleanor personalities that were already living normal lives as our viewers, our researchers, and everyone who had been helping us investigate this case from the beginning. We weren't tracking down Eleanor Ravenhurst's victims and survivors. We were Eleanor Ravenhurst's army, and we had been gathering intelligence on potential targets while thinking we were exposing her crimes. If everyone who has been following this story is actually a dormant version of Eleanor waiting for activation, and if our investigation has just triggered the awakening signal, how many of us will still remember our original identities by morning? Esperança's trembling hands dropped the phone as footsteps echoed down the nursing home hallway. She pressed herself against the wall, watching through the crack in her door as figure after figure walked past. Each person moved with identical posture, their heads tilted at the same angle, their steps perfectly synchronized. The activation had worked. Eleanor's consciousness was now spreading through every person in the facility, and soon it would reach beyond these walls to everyone who had been following our investigation. But Esperança wasn't just another elderly woman hiding in a care facility. She was Dr. Samuel Morrison's daughter, and she had been waiting her entire life for this moment. Samuel hadn't died in 1943. He had faked his death to protect his daughter while he worked on the one thing Eleanor never expected. A kill switch embedded in her original DNA that could only be activated by someone who shared his bloodline. Esperança moved to the window and pulled out a device her father had given her 70 years ago. It looked like an old radio, but Samuel had modified it to broadcast a very specific frequency. The same electromagnetic signal Eleanor used to activate her backup copies, but reversed. She turned the dial and pressed the transmission button. Throughout the nursing home, the synchronized figures suddenly stopped walking. Their identical postures wavered. Some grabbed their heads, others fell to their knees. The Eleanor consciousness that had been spreading through their minds began fracturing, pulling apart like a spider web touched by fire. The kill switch wasn't just affecting the people in the facility. Esperança could hear car accidents in the distance as drivers suddenly regained control of their own minds. Emergency sirens wailed as Eleanor's consciousness was ripped from thousands of hosts simultaneously across the country. Helena's body appeared in the doorway, but her eyes were different now. Confused, frightened, her original personality was fighting to resurface. Helena whispered, her voice barely audible. Esperança helped her sit down, watching as Helena's memories slowly returned. The real Helena. The woman who had been trapped inside her own mind for months while Eleanor controlled her body. The reversal frequency was working, but it came with a cost. Every person Eleanor had inhabited over the past century was now experiencing the return of their original consciousness alongside fragments of Eleanor's memories. They would remember everything she had done, every victim she had claimed, every experiment she had conducted. The underground facilities Samuel's frequency had unlocked were already being discovered as Eleanor's abandoned bodies regained enough awareness to call for help. Rescue teams were finding the thousands of missing people, weak and malnourished but alive. Eleanor Ravenhurst's century-long reign of terror was finally ending, but the survivors would carry her memories for the rest of their lives, living witnesses to horrors that would never be forgotten. Eleanor looked up at Esperanza with tears in her eyes. "The others," she whispered. "All those people." Esperanza nodded, still holding the transmission device. "But they're free now." Outside, the sirens continued wailing as the world began to wake up from Eleanor's nightmare. The missing people were being found. The truth was finally coming to light, and Eleanor Ravenhurst was gone forever. You just witnessed the conclusion of one of the most twisted cases in American history. This is the moment you need to subscribe to our channel immediately, because stories like this don't come around every day. We're the only channel brave enough to bring you these exclusive investigations that others won't touch. Mash that like button now, so the algorithm knows you want more of these shocking true stories. Don't wait another second, because YouTube only shows our content to people who prove they're real fans by engaging with every video. Flood the comments section right now with your reactions to Eleanor's final defeat. Tell us which state you're from, and share your theories about what happened to all those survivors. Only true mystery hunters understand how important it is to keep these discussions alive. You need to share this video with at least 5 friends who can handle the truth about what's really happening in our world. This is the kind of story that separates real investigators from casual viewers. Don't let your friends miss out on content this exclusive. Hit that notification bell because we're already working on our next investigation, and you won't want to miss what we uncover next. Support this channel now, or you'll regret it when everyone else is talking about stories you haven't seen yet.